My title is an associate teaching professor at Johns Hopkins in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. So I am employed as an instructor. I teach college level courses, and I am also a social and personality psychologist. So my research focus is on things like interpersonal relationships and human sexuality, morals and ethics, well-being, that kind of thing. So in terms of my day-to-day work, I do things like teach introduction to psychology and other courses on the topics that I mentioned. And I also put together some research on those topics. So in one of our studies, my colleagues and I were examining motivations for infidelity and the outcomes of infidelity in romantic relationships.
Very interesting. And how long have you been doing this?
So I have been a full-time faculty member for 12 years. I started at the University of Maryland in College Park, and then I moved over here to Johns Hopkins last year.
And I see a degree from Johns Hopkins, right?
Yes, that is correct. So I was a student here many years ago. I was a sophomore in college here 20 years ago exactly. And then I went to Stony Brook to do my PhD there in psychology before coming back down to Maryland.
Great. So this next question I want to ask you, just the first thing that comes to mind, because I know there's going to be a lot, but what is one of the most interesting pieces of research that you yourself have discovered that just stands out to you as really fascinating?
Well, I can say that I think it's fascinating that so what my dissertation research was on the dreams that people have about their romantic partners. And in the dreams that people have, the things that they're doing are so strikingly similar to the types of situations that people have while they're awake with their romantic partners or with others. So in the dreams that people have with their partners, they're doing things like going on dates, like they're going to the movies, the amusement park. They're also having sex. They're also having conflicts. There's jealousy, there's betrayal, there's infidelity. So there's all the stuff that we normally see people doing in their day-to-day lives, they're also doing in their dreams. And I think this is such an important idea, and I think a fascinating idea, because it shows just how much of our social lives are reflected in our dreams. And we still don't really know why that is. This is one of the, I think, unsolved mysteries of science, is why there's so much, like, why would we dream about sex? We still don't know. And a part of it could be because this is just what we're doing while we're awake. So the dream just reflects whatever we might be doing in our lives. On the other hand, there are some researchers who believe that we have dreams about things like sex and intimacy and betrayal in order to prepare us for those types of situations that we might experience after we wake up. So it might be a kind of rehearsal of things to come. It could also be, looking backwards, a way to make sense of our own past experiences and kind of consolidate memories. All of those are plausible ideas, but I think it's a neglected part of human experience, our dreams, especially dreams about the people that we're close with and the types of interactions we have that are focused on things like friendship and romance and sex.
What drew you to this profession?
Well, I think I've always been interested in understanding human behavior and in understanding why people do the things that they do, and just general questions about things like social connections and how people process things that happen to them, and and how we think about sex and relationships and morals and ethics. Like, I think that's just a fascinating topic to delve into and understand. As for this specific job, I have to say I didn't really know that this existed before I came to university and saw psychologists, like my mentors, doing this kind of work. And then I thought, this is cool. I want to do this, and got on that path. So I credit my advisors and mentors for putting me on the path to doing this job.
That's very kind. Yeah. Let's look at human sexuality, human connection, and morals tied to it, because I've heard you use that word a few times.
Yes.
What does that mean to you? Morals in this sphere?
Sure. Lots of different things.
Hmm.
So, on the one hand, we could look at morals and ethics from a kind of normative standpoint. And what this means is, generally speaking, what are the things that the average person would say, this is okay, this is acceptable, and this is not acceptable? Like, where is the line between those two things? So most people, for example, would say that sexual infidelity is immoral. And yet we see lots of people doing it anyway. And this presents a puzzle for scientists, for researchers like me, to try to figure out, well, how is it possible that so many people are engaging in a behavior that they will say is morally wrong? We could also look at it from the perspective of the specific types of moral concerns that people have. So moral foundations theory, which has guided a lot of my work, suggests that people care about not harming others, being fair to others, and then also being loyal to others and being pure, or basically avoiding things that are degrading and disgusting. And some researchers believe that there's a kind of general tendency for people to only focus on harm. But I think that when it comes to ethics for relationships and sex, that the other foundations, loyalty and purity, play a very big role in how people decide right from wrong. And I have a couple of papers that I've written about this topic. So when you ask people, for example, is it okay to date your best friend's ex? A lot of people say no. Some people say, well, sometimes, and some people say, absolutely, anyone is fair game. And so the range in people's responses is going to be significantly predicted by things like loyalty and purity values.
Interesting. So, if I'm understanding correctly, people that value loyalty and value whatever their definition of purity is, because that is also subjective.
Yep.
They are the people who would be more likely to say, no, you can't date your best friend's ex.
Correct. That is the correlation that we observe, but with the caveat that you just mentioned, which is the notion of purity concerns is going to be a little bit idiosyncratic. And some people will prioritize things like spirituality and connection to God, and some people will prioritize cleanliness. And so it's not going to be the same for everybody.
Yeah, and even, just thinking of, yeah, there are people that maybe just prioritize, or their value, they prioritize like connection in general. So if I have a strong connection to my best friend's ex, they will potentially honor that connection they're feeling more than potentially loyalty. It just depends on the value system.
That's correct. Yes.
That's really interesting. Would you say that people's actions in general are showcasing their values?
Great question. Yes and no. I think that in general, we tends to not want to do things that really strongly go against our values. That being said, I think people are generally okay with moral jaywalking. So if you think about how people are on their dating app profiles, like nobody's going to say that they're 6'5" if they're 5'5", but will they say they're 5'6"? Sure, like there's a little bit of a fudge factor going on there. And the same thing happens with people's resumes. And we tend to, this is based on not just my work, but other people's work in behavioral economics that shows people tend to lie, but on a little bit. And this is pretty common. So at the same time, I don't think most of us would want to consider ourselves liars. So there's just a little bit of, I wouldn't call it necessarily a moral inconsistency, although it could be. I would say it's a licensing factor. Like we allow ourselves to cheat a little bit in experiments. If you get people into the lab and you say, here's a math test, we're going to pay you for the number of questions you get right, maybe people add 1 or 2 questions onto it, but they're not going to add 25 questions onto it, because that would be too much of a moral violation. And I am interested to explore more this question of how people think with regards to something like romantic infidelity or sexual infidelity, where maybe they are considering a kind of moral jaywalking, where they don't think it's that big of a deal, rather than it being this huge thing that violates all of their core values.
Right. And there are always circumstances, right, that may give someone feel, or there are circumstances that may make people feel like maybe they have a little bit of an unspoken permission slip in a certain
Right.
area or way, because, well, I told them I'm confused. So, or whatever the case is. That is really interesting, and it's really complex because humans are complex. And so,
Yep.
and that complexity is fascinating to study. I can see how that would work. Yeah. I'm curious. Now I want to look at something that is very specific to our demographic, which is camming. So Live Jasmine is a cam site. And what's really interesting, one of the most fascinating things for me after working here is learning how different the business is actually versus its perception if you're not really seeing what's going on behind the scenes.
Sure.
So, for instance, I've interviewed hundreds of models. I've interviewed hundreds of members of the site at this point. And I've found that more times than not, the members I'm interviewing have a long-term relationship with a particular model. And when I say long-term, I mean like the longest I've interviewed is 18 years, 15 years, 10 years, 4 to 5 years on the lower end. And so this is a real bond actually at this point. And I've asked them, like, what is it about this person? They don't judge me. They accept me. They've always given me great advice. They've always listened to me. I've actually never seen her without her top on. Or, sorry, I've actually never seen her without her top off. She's my friend. Like things that you wouldn't think when you're looking at a cam site. And so the Kinsey Institute has been doing a lot of studies and research on Live Jasmine's user base. And they have found that the models that are having the longest calls in private, that are making the most money, tend to engage the least in anything explicit. People are there for an interaction, which logically makes sense when you realize like people can get free explicit sexual content online. You don't need to pay for it, you know? So when someone's spending money per minute for 10, 15 years on a site, you can only conclude that there's something beyond sexual content that's there. So looking at this through the moral code, because Society in general says camming, actually anything transactional, usually that's for a human need beyond like food and water. And certainly anything in regards to our sexuality being bought, sold, expressed in certain ways is not in line with society's mainstream moral code. I'm curious your thoughts on all of this.
Well, it does not surprise me at all to hear what you're describing about the the tendency for users to want to engage in a deep connection with the models. And the fact that they go on for so long is it could be reflecting an unmet need in their lives for just genuine social connection. And I don't think most people would find that motivation objectionable. Like from a moral standpoint, I don't think people would look at that and say, well, this person is doing something unethical because they're trying to engage in social connection with somebody else. I think sometimes when people think about morals and ethics, they think about what is, and then sometimes they think about what ought to be. And I think sometimes people envision a utopian world where everyone has their social connections needs met, and maybe we're trying to get there, but we're not even close to there, and we might not even be going in the right direction to get there. And so some other people might say, well, really, whatever helps people feel emotionally satisfied in their lives, or even sexually satisfied in their lives, like that's okay, because we understand that this is a basic human need. Now, unfortunately, I think there is a tendency for some who judge this type of thing as immoral to be maybe poorly informed or ignorant about basic needs. And this is where you see a lot of interesting cultural differences, because cultures vary in the extent to which they are pragmatic and practical about human needs. Like there's a stereotype of those in the Netherlands as being kind of free-loving, hippie-ish in terms of sex. But from what we know of their culture, it's actually the opposite. It's actually more like they're just being practical. They understand that people are sexual creatures and people have needs for social connection. And so the norms that they develop and the policies they craft are based on that idea that we know people are going to be doing these things. We might as well try to make it as benign and as safe as we possibly can. In America, I think there is a tendency for people who oppose things like camming or pornography or other types of sex work to think about it as something in and of itself based on a bad motivation. That, and there's this, I think, a denial of our basic instincts to want to connect with each other. And I think to answer another part of your question about the overlap here, I do think that our need for social connection and our need for sex go hand in hand in most cases. I think that is true for most people in most cases, that people don't want to be having sex with anonymous strangers as much as they want to be thinking about sex and having sex and maybe simulating sex with someone that they know and value and maybe care about to some extent. And the other thing that you mentioned about the nature of the connections between models and users in many cases not being sexual at all, like that to me is another fascinating and unexplored piece of this, because there's so many other avenues for people to make social connections. Why are people choosing this method for making social connections? Maybe it has to do with the perceived lack of available options, or maybe it has to do with something that is just spectacular about the service that's being provided, that people either are unaware of but trying to tap into, and maybe the average person who's not a user just doesn't see that, doesn't see that as a possibility.
Can I tell you one of my theories on this?
Sure.
Okay, because I really want your perspective as someone who is an active researcher on all of this. What I think part of it is first and foremost, the digital component creates a source of distance almost.
Right.
So this connection is not completely in your face. You're able to control it. If you're ever uncomfortable or you're upset, you can exit out. The other part of this, let's call it safety, that's becoming perceived because there's control, there's some distance, is the fact that this person, it's honestly like what it is with a therapist. They probably don't know anyone you know in your day-to-day life. And in general, they're not biased. They don't really have a dog in the fight. So you know that whatever they're going to say to you to some degree is unbiased and neutral. I think that people tend to respect those words more. But I'll tell you what I really think it is. I think that when you're put into this environment where the first rule is essentially it is okay for you to engage in something as vulnerable and explicit as sex. It's okay for you to talk about it, and there's no judgment here. That underlying unspoken and instant, almost like acceptance of whatever you're going to say in such a vulnerable area of yourself, I think creates this unspoken and almost instant, depending on what's going on, trust. So some people may start out just sharing things or saying things just to say it because of the nature of the site. And then when they're accepted in that place, or they're not judged in that place, or someone's like, tell me more about that, it really draws them in even more. And that's what I think too creates these 18-year, 15-year relationships between the model and the member that I've interviewed members about, is the fact that they're dealing with someone who has seen some of the most hidden parts of themselves that they hide from the world, from their family, from their friends, and accepted them anyway. I think that that is so bonding for the member.
Yeah. Yeah, that really resonates with me. I think that's a great insight. And I think that's got to be a big piece of it. It's just the vulnerability and the authenticity, something that people might really be craving in their lives in general with anyone else. And now they have it. And now they have that kind of rapport with someone that they're just not going to get elsewhere. The feeling that you're liberated from social judgments and that you can be your authentic self is something that a lot of people, I see self-help gurus and influencers talk about this all the time, being your authentic self and being vulnerable. And it's so hard for people to do that. It's hard to do it in the workplace. It's hard to do it with friendships and with family, with people you've known your entire lives. And now you have it with this person in this context. And that's the thing that people are searching for. This is like the holy grail of social connection. And you have it right here.
100%. I have found to be true in certainly these interviews, but in my own life and experience, and people around me, their life and experience, that when they feel a sense of acceptance, there is something about that particular perceived experience. Like even, my best friend, even sometimes when I'm judging myself and I'm like, oh, maybe I'm just being a brat here, or whatever the case is. And they're like, no, I can see why you would think that or feel that. I'm like, this is why you're my best friend.
Right.
There's still that degree of acceptance, even when I'm not giving it to myself. That to me is like one of the highest pursuits of human beings, is to feel accepted. Kind of to your point that you mentioned earlier, most people are not looking for sex with random people they don't have any connection with. Even if you meet someone at the bar and you sleep together that night, possibly, most likely, hopefully, there was some connection at the bar, right? There was some like flirting or fun or whatever the case is, there's still a connection, even if it's only been for 3 hours. I don't know. And I think the most surprising thing I've learned from these interviews is that it's not about sex, it's about connection.
Right. Yeah, and the research on hookups and casual sex also shows what you're describing, which is people enjoy it more when they feel some kind of meaningful connection with the other person. And I think people might feel, in a sense, like imagining a situation where two people meet at a bar and hook up, and they have no intention of having a relationship, but then one of them finds out that the other lied about their name and their job. Like, you'd feel betrayed by that. You'd feel a kind of moral violation, even though really all you were in it for was the sex. And that shows the power of connection in all of this.
Based off of the research you've done, what you've learned, what role do you think connection is playing in human sexuality? I always ask, and maybe there's no true answer to this question, I don't know, but I am curious your thoughts. Are we having sex as a means to have and feel connection, or are we giving connection to get sex?
Well, I think I can hear some of my colleagues saying it's both, and that's probably true. I think people, so if you ask someone who studies human sexuality through a lens of comparative biology, which is to say, let's look at humans in the context of other species like bonobos. Bonobos are very promiscuous creatures. They have sex a lot, but usually in the context of close-knit groups where they all know each other and they're sharing food and they're sharing social connection and sex at the same time. And I would say it's likely that humans have the same motivational tendencies to want connection and sex at the same time as part of in a sense, a community. We tend to have sex more in monogamous pairings, but we desire lots of sex beyond our monogamous pairings, even when we're highly satisfied. And this is an interesting part of my research in the psychology of infidelity, because we see how common infidelity is. And we also see, especially in my data, but in other researchers' data sets as well, there is a correlation between sexual satisfaction in affairs and emotional satisfaction in affairs. So people, when they have one, they tend to have the other at the same time. And what this shows, and this, I should also add, can also happen in the context of people feeling relatively satisfied and happy with their partners. In other words, they have their significant other, but then they also have an affair. And to the extent that the affair is giving them some kind of connection and sex at the same time, that tends to be what really makes people happy in those circumstances. Now, that doesn't make it okay. I don't want to say that I always say, cheating is okay here. What I think it is, it's complicated. And sometimes people cheat and they're really unhappy in their primary relationships with their spouses. Sometimes not. Sometimes the relationship is okay, but they're craving something. Sometimes people stay with the same partner for decades of their lives, and the passion is just not there after 30 years of being with the same person, and they are craving the connection and the sex with somebody else. And if it was just about sex, then we would see that. That might be a driver, that might be a motivating factor, people feeling like they're not getting the sex that they want from their partners. But at the same time, when there's cuddling involved, that seems to also be associated with happiness and good feelings in that sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel this is my personal opinion. This is not the opinion of anyone that anyone else. Um, I personally think that connection is king, or I believe that connection is above even just sex, in my opinion. Just even when I think about it down to how we have evolved in our DNA, connection and grouping and tribal, it meant survival. Now we can survive independently of each other to some degree, but we still use isolation as one of the highest forms of punishment. We put people in jail because it's so psychologically excruciating, I think.
Yeah.
Really interesting. Um, and I like that interesting distinction of the fact that usually when there is satisfaction in sex, there's satisfaction on the emotional component and vice versa.
Yep.
I'm curious, what do you think, based off of the lens of your research, are some of the misconceptions about human sexuality that are kind of mainstream?
Well, how long do we have here? It'd be a whole book on that. Um,
You should.
okay, so I think the one so I'll tell you about something that I like to emphasize when I'm teaching human sexuality to my students. I think that one of the biggest, if not the biggest, misconception about sex is that sex exists in humans in order for us to procreate. And the reason that I think this is a misconception is because, I mean, on a very, very basic biological level, that's true. In our evolutionary ancestry, this is how sexual reproduction evolved. This is how it came to be, is organisms would sexually reproduce in order to have offspring, and they would have sex in order to reproduce. But humans have sex primarily for pleasure and social connection, and other reasons too. But I think the extent to which we go to great lengths to avoid having babies. We develop birth control and contraception, and we have abortion. We go to great lengths to stop that process from happening, and yet to continue having sex even when we know reproduction is impossible, like, for example, at certain points in women's monthly cycles and also after menopause, we still continue to have sex for its own sake. And that, I think, is more central to our experience of sex than a desire to procreate and have babies. And once you understand that, then I think it unlocks a whole lot of other possibilities for understanding human sexuality in a really deep and also true way. Because I think the misconception that people have sex primarily for procreating leads to some dark roads. It leads to thinking about sex as a means to an end, thinking about it in transactional terms, thinking about it as something only to be experienced with one person throughout your life, the person that you're going to, that you want to have kids with. And I think those are all really bad ideas. And I think the truth is that babies are secondary, and the primary motivations involve pleasure and connection and other things about our bodies and our social lives that seems to come first.
I think, as you're saying that, and I'm thinking about it, I'm like, that's right. Actually, that's very true. Um, it is interesting that we don't think that way, though, and we're not taught that way. That is the one thing that I've noted whenever I talk to someone about sex ed that you get in middle school. As an adult now, when I look back on what I learned, the thing that to me stands out that it was missing was the fact that sex was pleasurable at all, or that there was any reason outside of making a baby to have sex. I didn't
Yeah.
know that that was the case as a child, learning through sex ed. But when you think about when people first start having sex, and in general, it's different for everyone, but in general, let's say it's potentially somewhere in the teenage years or very early 20s, most of the time, the thought of having, like you mentioned, any type of children is we go to great lengths to avoid that. That's not what we're trying to do. We're, having sex because we have a boyfriend or girlfriend, or it's our first love, or there's something there that we're having sex for that has absolutely nothing to do with procreating. That is, in general, I think most people's first experiences of sex is not to get to procreate. So it's just interesting you say that, because yeah, it's when you think about when you first started having sex, was it to have a baby? Most likely not.
I mean, there might have been a point in time when that was the case, but I
Right.
don't think that's the case now.
No, it's not the case now in general for most people, I would say. But you're right. Maybe at some point, and maybe in some cultures that may still be true, or religious practices.
Right.
But that is a good one. That is a good misconception. Can you give us one more?
Um, okay, let me think. Okay. I think part of, and this is actually something that I think is related to sex and also romantic relationships. I think that there is a misconception that people have in terms of the importance of initial compatibility and chemistry with a partner. Like if it's not there right away, then it's never going to be there. And I would suggest that actually, like pretty much anything else, it takes effort and time and patience to get to know yourself, your own body, to get to know your partner and their likes and dislikes, and work towards building that compatibility rather than it kind of magically being there at the start. Sometimes people in relationships research call this a destiny belief versus a growth belief. And the destiny belief is there needs to be some compatibility right away. Otherwise, it's not going to be there. The spark has to be right there. You're going to see it immediately, versus the growth mindset, which is actually, this is something that this is a process. Like we're going to get there. We're going to get to the point where it is at its peak, but that is something that requires effort and patience in order to do. And so I think I think that is a healthier way to think about sex and relationships, is with the mindset that, even if you meet the person of your dreams, that relationship and that connection may not be at its peak right away. And so having that mindset, I think, is healthier.
Mm-hmm. I have heard that before. Actually, this woman, her name's Dr. Pat Allen. She's been a relationship and a psychologist for 60 years. She's almost 90. And
Wow.
she actually, yeah, she's she's great. She's a firecracker, but she actually specifically encourages women to go on at least 3 dates with someone before they make any conclusions about chemistry, because she said that women in particular, although it can happen in both genders, it takes a little bit more time for them to fully recognize and feel that spark, whereas men in general can feel it a little bit faster. But yeah, she said to give it more time.
Right.
For that exact reason, because it might be there and you just may not have registered it on the first or second or even third date. So
Right.
very interesting. Is there anything about your work, human connection or sexuality, camming, that we didn't talk about but you wanted to share?
Not sure that I can think of any. I mean, I'm glad to hear that you're collaborating with the Kinsey Institute and doing research, and I hope to see more of that published. And yeah, if there's anyone from any granting agencies listening to this conversation, don't hesitate to pour your money into sex research. I mean, this is such an important part of human experience that I would say does not get the funding priority that it does. And again, I don't know who's listening that's in a position of influence or power in that area, but I think that is a really crucial piece of science. And I hope to see all of the research disseminated to the public and that people could benefit from it. I know that a lot of research gets translated and applied in clinical contexts. A lot of the time when I give talks or interviews like this one, the audiences are clinical psychologists, therapists, and social workers, and that's great, and they can certainly make use of that and benefit from it in their work. But I think the average person could really benefit a lot from it too. So I just generally support the dissemination of sex research and science, and I'm glad to have these conversations for that reason.
Yeah, thank you very much. I always joke that I think we know more about the moon right at this point than human sexuality, which seems to be so complex. Um,
Right.
yeah, that's a great point. I'm definitely glad you said that because yes, sex research is also stigmatized, it seems like. My final question to you is based off of your experience, your career, your research, what do you think are our next steps, either collectively or individually, in creating a more sexually well accepting society?
Yeah, great question. Well, it's hard to see. Yeah, I'm not good at making predictions, and I'm not good at forecasting what will happen in the future. I mean, I don't think any of us saw Chat GPT becoming what it was in the past year, and who knows where that's going. I think there's going to be a lot of really important and interesting developments with regards to technology. Um, you know, I guess one of the priorities that I would have is making better condoms. I would want to see us putting a lot of energy and effort into that. I know that's something that a lot of the wealthy donors have been interested in for a very long time, and it hasn't really materialized yet. But maybe there is going to be some big innovations in technology with regards to sex that will help us kind of progress in that direction. I wish I had better insight about what's to come. I feel like I'm not a good prognosticator, but I can express some wishful thinking at least.
Yeah, and honestly, the hope is that we can start influencing what's to come and seeing where we can make differences and expand our understanding of things, or like you said, just certain practical things like condoms. Other people have said making sex toys safer because
Yeah.
the materials are not safe. um yeah, and just becoming more accepting, more well versed. That's part of the goal of these interviews, is to give people this information. Like you said, usually when you're giving talks talking about some of these subject matters, it's people in there that are already trained in these topics, therapists, social workers, that type of thing. Our goal is to get these interviews in front of anyone that
Yeah.
wants to learn more.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for giving us your time today.
You're very welcome.